And finally, probably one of the last Chris Ann articles I will do this year, because usually, now that we're actually halfway through this year, I think it should be worth noting that I know I may have sort of flip-flopped a little bit about trying to give too much of my own spin on things, because it's kind of a good way to try to compare. I know trying to compare yourself to Chris is usually not a very good idea, but the reason why it's so easy to do it is because it's when you begin to see through what Chris could only describe as the eyes to hell, you begin to realize that maybe your own situation is not nearly as bad. So that's maybe the only reason why I do it. But from the point of view of this article, I think I might do it a little bit more than most, because this one is going to hit a little bit home to me as far as I can work out, because it concerns Chris and his writing prowess. I'll get into what I mean by spin later on, so let's just get started, shall we? This article discusses Chris's writing from a literary perspective. Chris's general abilities were written in English, such as with spelling and grammar. See Chris in English with the written language as well. So, let's begin, shall we? I do believe it wouldn't be published, not because of the art style, but because of the story. I mean, no one wants to read this. This is comic artist Mara Wilde on Sonichu. They should have, you know how they usually have reviews on the backs of comics and stuff like that, or in books. That's what, yeah, Chris may have missed a trick in not doing it. Chris's writing is marked by many flaws that have persisted throughout his creative output. General problems. See also Chris and Art, specifically the Sonichu comic. Chris's English skills. At the heart of it, Chris's writing is rather two-faced. Despite the subject matter frequently being completely unsuitable for children, Chris shows a juvenile, simple writing style. But at times he throws in and misses college-level vocabulary words and attempts to use advanced sentence structure. He is quite fond of semicolons, even if he uses them to link together two unrelated sentences. In order to make his stories more professional, the result is a confusing, jumbled writing style. General issues with the comic. Chris frequently pauses from the action to describe exactly what a character is wearing and expound upon trivial aspects of characters in unnecessary detail. Exactly, you know what? In a comic book, you don't need to do this. Part of the appeal of a comic book is that there is artwork, there is visual clarity. If you genuinely think your audience can't see what you're trying to draw, then, you know what? Pick one. Either it's meant to be in book form or it's meant to be a comic book. Chris is trying to have his cake and eat it. It's pick one or don't have both, even when it has no relevance to the plot. Inversely, he frequently glosses over important things that may have relevance at some point. Even in action scenes, Chris will frequently pause in order to introduce something completely irrelevant. The overall presentation is consistently sloppy, marked by unwieldy turns of phrase and elementary typography errors that suggest that Chris does not proofread anything he creates before putting it on the internet. That's I would say a good 80% of things that go on the internet usually are put out there in one go, but considering Chris is trying to come across as professional, this is publishing 101 is you always proofread everything. I don't care if it's from the letter A to a full stop, you check everything. Because what some of you people might not know is that my grandmother was a typist, which means that her English as well as her grammar had to be perfect. And she was very, very well adapted to the task because she knew what she was doing. Or if there were problems, she had to... Because remember, my grandmother used a typewriter. So it meant that unlike moving from typewriters to keyboards, there was no backspace function. You did it perfectly in the first go, or you didn't. But either way, you still had to know what you were doing. The overall presentation is consistently sloppy, marked by unwieldy turns of phrase and elementary... Okay, also, Chris has the habit of using the font Comic Sans to type, which, while commonly used for material intended to be read by children, is generally considered lazy, cliched, and ugly. Chris's use of the font is particularly incongruous. Yeah? Might be, yeah. Chris has the habit of using the font Comic Sans to type, which, while commonly used for material intended to be read by children, is generally considered lazy, cliched, and ugly. Chris's use of the font is particularly incongruous, especially since it has been used to lovingly describe such scenarios in Sonichu as mass murder, gratuitous sexual activity, and blatant wish fulfillment. Luckily, in Sonichu 12-9, he moved on to Proxima Nova. However, there are other comic book fonts that are more closely resemble professional comics out there, some of which can be downloaded for free. They're not wrong about this, by the way. I've been using free texts and fonts since 2020. This is not, revolutionary. This is just way people do it to save money. There's nothing wrong with that. If the resources are available for free, that's not cutting corners. That's just getting it on the cheap. Chris produces no preparatory writing of any sort for his stories. Content to make them up as he goes along, and putting the overall narrative at the mercy of his moods and fancies. This isn't bad writing, as several movies like The Social Network, Mission Impossible Fallout, and even Star Wars had its plot being written up along as they were being filmed. But the difference is that those events made up in the films made sense, while Sonichu's events are randomized. Chris regularly changes his mind as to what the story should be and contradicts what has come before as he pleases. Now, to be fair again, there are plenty of movies out there as well that seem a little bit confused as to what the story actually is, but whatever the story ends up being, everything else just sort of is in the background or is something to... Sometimes movies do that to play to the idea that there's a lot of things going on in a person's head and maybe they may not be entirely focused on the task they at hand. There are plenty of movies that do this, but it's not necessarily when Chris does it. I don't think even Chris even knows what he wants at the end of this. Unable to comprehend why this would bother his audience, he also often introduces and foreshadows seemingly important plot elements that never substantially contribute to the plot or are developed abruptly when Chris loses interest in them. Chris as a graphic storyteller. To the surprise of nobody, Chris is no Alan Moore, and Sonichu is no Watchmen. Chris makes no effort to work to the strengths of the medium of graphic literature, and instead approaches writing comics more like a television series or anime in structure, using storytelling techniques and visual information that work in those mediums but not so well on paper. He is ignorant towards comic books and how they are supposed to work as a sequential narrative. Despite a desire to work for major companies like DC, Marvel, Dark Horse, and Archie, Chris has never shown any real interest towards those companies and their publications. Though he did seem vaguely aware of the miniseries Marvel Zombies in one of the Alec Benson Leary calls, criticizing its violent and parodic nature despite admitting to have never read it. I mean, to be fair, I've never read Marvel Zombies either, but I have heard it's quite interesting. Including things like Deadpool kills the Marvel Universe, I heard is... Well, just the title alone is very intriguing. Within Sonichu itself, his Mary Sue insert has referred to the comic as an anime, not a manga, and himself as its director, and has given it ratings such as TV-14, etc., which only apply to television standards. Sonichu isn't so much a work designed to be a comic, which balances graphic and literary storytelling, but rather an economic storyboard and or script for a hypothetical TV show or video game, peppered with his other secret weapon. Exposition. Can I just say for the record right now that, listen, I know I've tried to keep it quiet about this point, but listen, I've been writing scripts since 2018. and I've been writing storyboards and even doing storyboard art since 2017. And just looking at this, just that is, and I've been reading comic books since I was about 14 years old, and I've been reading manga ever since I was 10. And I gotta say, this, and again, I don't want to like start getting into like hyperboles or anything like that, but that is a disgrace right there. That is just, that's not how you do this. It's just walls of text. It's not even like structured properly. Like there should be like a space here where they needed on a separate line. There's loads of things in here that it looks ugly, and that this is also why you don't use Comic Sans, because even visually it looks hideous. The fact there's no background whatsoever. The fact that Chris couldn't even bother to draw out, I don't know, maybe an extended part of his body and just have a separate like box here just for Chris to shove a Sonichu ball, and then another box here to demonstrate that Magi-Chan has been given the Sonichu ball, and the fact that the speech bubble just sort of stops at the point where Magi-Chan's severed arm begins and goes towards up here. The fact that even Magi-Chan doesn't look like he's even engaging Chris either. Except maybe when he does, because for some reason the expression looks exactly the same. Leading me to, well, it's not exactly a copy-paste of Magi-Chan, but that again, I said it's an absolute disgrace to storytelling. Exposition. 15 minutes of dialogue and a transformation later. Chris not even trying anymore. I didn't realize, yeah, in Sonichu issue 9 is where this all took place. Now, I should also, I feel like what I might want to do is do like a separate video again about the ways in which I would probably have to fix Sonichu from a writing perspective, from an artistic perspective, from a structural standpoint, to even the layouts of a comic book, if that's really what Chris was going for. A common thread in discussions of creative writing is the doctrine of show don't tell. When writing English, rather than having events merely be told to the reader through characters, if possible, the author should feature the scene as it happened, with the characters being a part of it. This point was clearly lost on Chris. Now, I will say, however, there are instances in fiction where sometimes if you're like, okay, here's an idea. Who here has ever played the video game Dark Souls? And who here remembers how that game begins? It begins with exposition about how the world came to be, about how the souls of lords were found in fire, the first war between the lords fought against the everlasting dragons, and the only point to any of this was just to describe you some of the key figures of the first game and how the world has come to be, and more importantly, that this world is not going to last forever. It gives you not an unsubstantial amount to work with, including themes of rebellion, of disparity, of a changing of the guard. From Gwyn and his faithful knights to desperately trying to hold on to what shred of life over his kingdom he has left, devolving from the Lord of Sunlight to the Lord of Cinder, to the stories about the Witch of Izalith trying to create a second flame of life, as a result destroying Izalith and turning its followers into demons, including hideous deformations from the Daughters of Chaos and the one brother of Chaos. Then, of course, about Gravelord Nito becoming extremely reclusive to the point where he just hides in his pit deep in the Tomb of Giants. There are many other examples again, but the point of those sort of scenes is that they tell you necessary information, but it doesn't tell you the full story. It doesn't tell you anything about Siegward. It doesn't tell you anything about the stories about the Way of Light Covenants. It doesn't tell you the story of Knight Artorias. It doesn't tell you the story of Manus, father of the Abyss. It doesn't tell you the story of why Guinevere is just an illusion to prevent the light from fading in Anno Londo. It doesn't tell you why Gwyndolin is left to just guard the tomb of his father. It doesn't. There are lots of things the game tells you through item descriptions, but it doesn't. Some things you have to like join the pieces together, but it's stuff like that that makes Dark Souls such a fascinating experience, because they're not outright going to tell you through exposition. There's very little exposition when you think about it in any From Software game. It's all about what you do, what the player does, and how the actions of what you do affect the world you live in. I even once wrote a video essay describing the single most underrated and underrepresented and the most important character in all the Dark Souls games is you, the player. You are the most important, because it is you who breaks out of the Northern Undead Asylum. It is you who trundles all the way to Majula from Things Betwixt. It is you who are brought back from the outskirts of the Kingdom of Lothric. And even in something like Elden Ring, it is you who are to emerge as Elden Lord, as one ye tarnished, and, well, the rest is history. And that's the sort of thing I absolutely have come to like use as almost like a basis for the things I do, because in stuff like that, events are very specifically character motivated and driven. The events that happen in these games are as a result of what the characters do. It's not about, well, it can sometimes be about like unnatural forces or some war that is completely unwinnable on both sides, and yet fighting is continued and is not presented as fruitless. There are things like that happen, but again, they show you this. I even have the entire Dark Souls like comic book itself, which contains at least 4 stories. I think of mostly just one-off characters that travel across certain lands in the first set, basically in Lordran. But I'm getting way ahead of myself, because, to be honest, Chris should have taken some note about... This is why, again, I have to, like, concede and just openly admit, this is why you need to, like, read or look into other media in terms of, like, how do you structure a story? How do you build a narrative? For those who've ever read Frankenstein, you know how the narrative structure goes from... First you learn about Wotan, then Victor Frankenstein tells you about his story, and then later down the line, right in the middle, the monster tells about his story, and then it goes back to Victor Frankenstein, and then it talks about Wotan's story again, and being in the North Pole. It's a story within a story, which, ironically, they were talking about Alan Moore before, because that's what happens somewhat in Watchmen. There is a comic book within a comic book. But alas, let's keep going. As a writer, Chris is over-reliant upon exposition, to the point that some works, such as the high school story, contain nothing else Chris does not like to illustrate facts of his stories through example, and instead expects the reader to accept his word as gospel, leaving no room for interpretations that are not true and honest. Confusing dialogue for exposition, Chris believes that his level of exposition is normal in mainstream comics. When Chris ripped off the comic Rose-Chu's Story for use in Sonichu 15, practically page for page, he added in heavy exposition. When criticized by fans by this, Chris commented, "Rose-Chu's Story, it definitely compares and contrasts to my very own that goes beyond literal small talk. In my defense on the heavy dialogue, I have lots of wisdom and thoughts to share, so I digress. It beats saying one line, leaving it at that, and not getting the explanation and thought across. Big difference between Teen Titans and Teen Titans Go. Go has decreased explanatory dialogue, and look at how crappy it is. The original show offers the greater detail in good ways." Well, no, that's Chris. First of all, I have to let me step in because I really need to like nail this one on the head so people don't get the wrong idea. Definitely compares and contrasts to my own that goes beyond literal small talk. But has Chris ever watched a show where literally a person will stand for like 5 minutes at a time, literally just expositing things? No, you don't see that in television because that's boring. People don't have the patience to sit around and listen to somebody talk for 5 minutes in a row. And then, in my defense, the heavy dialogue, I have lots of wisdom to share. Well, if that's true, then how come we don't pick on any of this? Also, there's the difference between wisdom and thoughts to share, and then you completely clogged up an entire page of text for no real reason apart from you think that you have the right to because you've got thoughts to share. But the problem is that I would like to state to all the readers that between these pages and all other pages, such as the Aspechu pages, all characters of any supported links are not linked at all. The redrawn characters any of the Aspechu pages of their personalities and fates are not even similar to the original characters who originated within any of my own books or pages or anything else originally created from my own mind and hand. For example, the original Flying Rosechew, Grass, and Fighting Sonichews named Angelica, Wild, and Punchy and are all still alive and well. That is fact. The Happy Tree Friend-esque deaths in the Aspechu pages are pure fiction and unofficial. The real Wild Sonichew is straight, working as Quickville's leading carpenter with Simona Rosechew as his sweetheart. The Quickville's leading builder, constructor, and architect. The original Sonichew is not related to Aspechu/Mr. Sonichew at all. Punchy is not weak. With fight moves against steel types, he wins, no barrier. Also, Bubbles is not stupid. She is a very smart and careful woman with a stern personality, with serious and bubbly when happy and at peace. And Magi-chan is not a mindless idiot drained of all the intelligence and psychic prowess. Magi-chan is an all-powerful with greatest intelligent, strong, well, and toughest psychic powers imaginable. And none of them, the true original Chaotic Combo members, have ever been or ever will be anywhere in the state of Minnesota, or have any acquaintances with Aspechu/Mitch Sonichew at all, unless I decide so later on. Thank you for continuing to read the original Sonichew and Rosechew pages created only by my mind, heart, and hand. Now, I could sit here for the next hour and 10 minutes talking about how the fact that, well, these would be... Well, Chris wouldn't... First of all, Chris wouldn't need to mention anything about Aspechu whatsoever if Chris didn't draw them into his comic at all. Chris would not have to specify that the Chaotic Combo was weak if he actually drew them as being intelligent. Also, Chris... We kind of got the idea that, because of what happens earlier in the comic, we know fine well the original Chaotic Combo are nothing like the Aspechu / Mitch Sonichew counterparts that Chris drew in, and for some reason, Chris didn't even think about, I don't know, giving them something like a little bit distinct so that we could, if there were people who couldn't differentiate between the two. That's the other problem I've mentioned before, is that Chris is strangely not very clear about what he means, because again, visual clarification is a lot more concise, and it's actually far better to comprehend than literally just slamming an entire page of text because you think that's somehow easier to do. And by the way, Chris was still whinging, by the way, that it took him as long enough to do this. In addition, Chris critically fails at the literary element of show don't tell. Even in illustrated action scenes, choosing instead to describe what a character is doing between asterisks. So notable offenders are cuts vines, crash to grass, teleports in, and makes Gunner do a 180. This is the sort of things you do in a storyboard, by the way. You don't do them in the final draft of for your work to be published. This is what storyboard artists would do to display to the animator about what action needs to be taken place, and they can't necessarily convey it. Well, this is really the only way they can sort of convey it, which shows that the idea of onomatopoeia is lost to him. In these cases, examples including slice, thump, whoosh, and perhaps squeak would have told the readers the same thing, but with a lot more emphasis on what's going on. Characterization. Chris's characters, as they are written, are distinguishable only by the vaguest surface elements. Chris's view of ideal personalities in men and women is clear to him. And because he wants all of his creations to be perfect, his characters are barely distinct variations on a theme. Chris does not comprehend the appeal of characters with flaws. In his second call with Alec Benson Leary, Chris explained because he considers all of his characters to be very much real, living things that exist in some sort of cartoon universe. Giving them flaws would amount to tormenting a living creature in the context of the conversation. Chris defended bleaching Asperchu into Mitch Sonichu because the character shouldn't have to suffer his original name. His general response to the criticism that his characters lack personality is denial. And again, I don't understand. Again, Chris, how many? You know how I was talking about before about the idea that Chris, for those who haven't seen the video I talked about Chris and reading, well, it's kind of strange in some way that even if I was not to accept the idea that Chris read a lot more than he was letting on about shows that probably influenced his decision, well, books that influence his decision, but what about the TV he watches? Did any of them have any influence in this whatsoever? Because I don't think Chris has really comprehended why those sorts of things worked. I mean, you want me to give you a very interesting example? What about say a pre Disney era season of Power Rangers? You know how because there are some seasons of Power Rangers where there are plenty of characters and characterizations, and you see how none of them are perfect. I mean, you just need to take Wild Force, for example. You could see Cole was very brash and very heroic, but he was very inexperienced and not exactly accustomed to the trials and tribulations in the real world, and the horrible realization that what has happened, that there are some things that happen in the world which can only be as the result of people who have no heart or shame or honor whatsoever, which is kind of the sort of metaphor for the orcs that happen in Wild Force, is they are creatures with no hearts and therefore have lost basically any semblance of humanity and must be destroyed as they are a threat to the Earth and the Animaria. That's just what it... And I know why that stuff works too, because it makes the idea that there's a very distinctive idea of good versus evil. And I only do that in the case of Wild Force because that's the closest thing I can really compare this to. But no, that's not even fair to Wild Force. This is like Megaforce was probably had it better than... Even that does it better than what Sonichu is, because all of his characters are deemed as perfect, with no characterizations and no real flaws to speak of. And I've watched Megaforce, and that show was boring, because there was no actual story whatsoever to speak of. And that's the same issue with Sonichu, is that there's no real story to speak of. So why on earth do we have to care? You know what I mean? The indistinct characterizations of the Sonichu cast are reflected in their dialogue. Chris does not use dialogue to suggest distinct personalities and worldviews. All characters are equally capable of speaking as Chris does, and from Chris's perspective, including small children. Giving to the idea that, again, Chris seems to have underestimated the idea of how hard it is to actually write things for children. It is, like I said before, it is one of the hardest things you can do, is trying to write things for children. Which is why I've often said that if somebody asked me to write an episode of Sesame Street, I would have to spend at least a good month trying to devise it, because I think writing for Sesame Street has got to be one of the hardest things you can do as a writer. If you were a TV writer, I should say. Because it's not because I wouldn't know where to start, but every single aspect has got to be perfect because of your audience, and if they are going to pick up on things that they might not be able to comprehend. And bear in mind, Sesame Street has done this plenty of times, but I don't particularly think it was... Has anyone... I mean, I've never seen it, but there was an episode of Sesame Street that talked about the after effects of September 11. Well, 9/11. We'll just say it that way. I've never seen that episode myself, but I'm absolutely adamant to say I might literally just use that as an example, because I've heard it's one of the best episodes that they ever did of Sesame Street. More importantly, it's one of the things that... Imagine if there were kids growing up in New York when this happened, and, well, what do you do? How do you explain it? How do you explain something like that to a child who doesn't have any idea why or how any of this could happen? It's a good thing Chris doesn't really tackle serious issues when it comes to Sonichu, because that could be even more detrimental to the fact that Chris is... That's the thing as well. Chris doesn't really have morals in these stories either, so Chris can't even use that as an explanation to why they should be written for children, because it just sort of doesn't. This in turn leads to 3 basic stock personalities. All males, except for Chris, are superficial idiots who are only interested in fucking and enforcing Comic Chris's draconian laws. All of the females, with the partial exception of Sleweel, and vicarious sluts who only want to fuck, shop, and cock, or cook, in that order no less, and Comic Chris comes off as a murderous, insane dictator of a militaristic city-state enforced by a paramilitary street police and a pack of superpowered goons, with immunity from prosecution and freedom to commit any atrocities they and he please, utilizing a psychic hedgehog to spy on his citizens to make sure there are no gay people, and gleefully reveling in the pain he inflicts on those whom he denies or deems unworthy. You know, this would actually lead into a very interesting conspiracy, is that what Chris actually... And here's actually, ironically, the genius of Sonichu. And yes, believe it or not, there is such thing as a genius in Sonichu, is that you could take an idea like that and run with it, of somebody who is parading that he is the hero when he is actually the villain. Now, I have heard of a show called... I think it's called... is it called The Boys that has Homelander? And you realize that Homelander is basically the villain of the whole show, because he is Superman who, with no real sense of boundaries or restraint, so he can do what he likes whenever he wants, and there is no force to stop him. And then there are many other stories as well that tackle aspects like this, about whether or not Dr. Manhattan is really a hero at all. Or what about Superman Red Sun, an Elseworld story that describes what would happen if the capsule containing Superman landed in Soviet Russia compared to the US? Or what about What's So Funny About Truth, Justice, and the American Way, when Superman confronts the elite run by Manchester Black, and Manchester Black is basically just an English version of Homelander, and Superman demonstrates to Manchester Black why his maneuvers are wrong, because Superman plays by the elite's rules, and basically Superman gives Manchester Black a lobotomy just to destroy his powers. And this is what I'm talking about, the idea of something like Sonichu, is that I'm not saying it's something like Man in the High Castle or 1984, but why don't you present the idea of a draconian, murderous, insane dictator who is finally brought to justice and they're going to threaten to wipe out his entire city and its civilians, and he has to demonstrate to all the world why he is in the right for doing the things that he's done, for the crimes against humanity. And you could even present the idea that Chris's rule isn't really wrong at all. That's something what a smart writer would do, is that take something that sounds incredibly a black and white issue and you start muddling it together. You make it look incredibly grey. you fight it with evidence that presents the idea that Chris might be really well be the hero all along, despite everything he does. But the problem is again, I know that's wishful thinking, because I'm sure I know that's not really how it happens. Which is one of the biggest problems I could have had as well with that. That's the sort of thing that could have turned like Sonichu from just a scrappy, low-budget, passionate, if misguided attempt at a comic book into a legitimate work of art. But instead, it's just a work of fart, not art. But you know what I'm getting here at? And that's something like that could work. It absolutely probably could work. An idea like literature, books, TV shows that are presented in one way, but actually you could reverse this methodology entirely to present them as being in the wrong. Stuff like that can work, absolutely. Animal Farm in many cases is like this, where Napoleon takes control of the farm by force, by forcing Snowball into exile, and it seems as though the pigs are actually doing things for the best interest because they are smarter and wiser than the rest of the animals. But then it comes out to the fact that they have only done it so they can claim all the power for themselves. But without any sort of like real leadership, could it be suggested that the animals would know what to do? And even when they had the opportunity to actually stop Napoleon and his dogs, could it be suggested that the animals were in the right for continuing to do as the pigs pleased, or whether or not they had the opportunity but they decided not to do anything because, like the sheep, they just bleated on and on about how 4 legs good, 2 legs better? Could it be argued maybe the animals were the ones in the wrong for trying to fight against the laws of nature, but they didn't really do it of their own accord? They only did it through the mouth of Old Major. I know I'm really dragging all of this out, but this is the sort of power like writing a great story can have. It can completely turn the balance in terms of how you can make people think and what could actually be portrayed as good or evil. And then we have stuff like this. Sonichu could have been, the twist could have been that the PVCC were the real heroes all the time, and that they were just trying to put Chris in his place because he couldn't get away with the things he was doing. Not in this lifetime, apparently. Just as the protagonists are designed to be Chris's bland, homogeneous vision of an ideal heroism, the antagonists are simply evil for the sake of being evil. The villains, more often than not, act with no apparent motivation whatsoever other than an abstractly contrived desire to bully Chris by sabotaging his heroic efforts to get a girlfriend. And ironically, you could have made this work in some strange way. I know, when we think about it like that, even that's basically the crux of their villainy, is just to make Chris's life miserable, not to actually put an end to Chris in any way. But again, look at all the great villains in history that Chris could have modeled stuff after. Vlad the Impaler, the Joker, Dio, Darkseid, Thanos, Clyde Cash. There's no real distinct figurehead or fiend or methodology. Even John Kramer, the Jigsaw killer from the Saw franchise, he had a distinct look. He had a methodology. He had a method to his madness. Their madness is just because they think it's funny to troll Chris. How they would prosper from this is unknown, especially considering that they have not once ever come close to defeating the Hedgehogs. Since Chris doesn't see the appeal in protagonists with flaws, he likewise doesn't see the appeal in villains with redeeming qualities, probably because most of his enemies are avatars of real people whom Chris genuinely believes are involved in a conspiracy against him. The closest thing to a sympathetic villain is Blake, but only because he has a raging heterosexual libido, just like all the other furries in the comic. Consequently, any attempt at character development fails miserably. Chris makes any change in character by indicating, in exposition of course, something akin to "it just happened." With Blake, who arguably goes through the most stark change in character, an antagonist becoming a supporting character, there is absolutely no moral struggle or any build-up to the moment he defects to the side of good. His sudden infatuation with Bubbles, who beat him almost to death a few issues prior, and a brief nonchalant mention of mistreatment at the hands of his master are all the reasons the reader is given for why Blake changed sides. Blake isn't even the worst offender either. No reason is given for Wes Isley's defection to the enemy at all, despite last being seen as a rival to Chris, yet still ostensibly on his side. Wes is suddenly placed with the antagonist long after seemingly becoming irrelevant in Chris's reality. Dialogue. Chris only uses dialogue as an expository device in his comics in the bluntest fashion possible. Chris feels the need to include extensive amounts of dialogue in his comic, resulting in text wars that demand type so small that they often need to become illegible. Text walling is Chris's preferred method to dictating the story as he means for it to be experienced by his reader. Chris has defended this practice due to feeling a preference to elaborate because some people rarely get visual references. I'm sorry, what? On a similar note, speech often includes hand-drawn emoticons to display what the speaker is feeling, affirming the notion that Chris doesn't believe that his artwork or dialogue alone can convey his ideas, in addition to his total ineptitude with emotions. Well, maybe Chris should have decided to become an abstract artist instead and, made some sort of skyscraper out of crumbled up balls of paper. That's the sort of thing, like an amalgamation of half-baked ideas culminated in some sort of empire of his own destruction. That's actually quite poetic for me. I'm actually kind of pleased with myself. I said that all by myself. Even when not text walling, Chris's dialogue is highly unnatural. He appears to have no grasp of voice, with nearly all his characters using the same stilted tone, verbosity, and quickisms. This can easily be seen in earlier issues, where the phrase "boyfriend-free girl" pops up from multiple characters. This may be a symptom of his lacking theory of mind. He believes that, since he talks in this fashion, so does everybody else. The heavy-handedness, stiltedness, and single-mindedness of his dialogue can be seen as symptomatic of Chris's autism. I mean, when half the page, like a quarter of the page, is just white with text hand-drawn in instead of, typed in. And the fact that, again, this is all on just one page, so, any real comic artist, what they would have done is that this would have been half a page, and there would have been smaller panels beneath it, so that dialogue could be fitted in, one from Chris's perspective, and then from Project SNT's perspective, and then maybe another shot with the camera behind them and saying, fine, I be my guest, and then they move on. It gives the indication of movement, of time, the fact that a conversation has sort of come to an end, that they faced, that you can sort of see where they're going, provided if there was a shot of a town in their line of vision. And by the way, can I just say, ladies and gentlemen, you've probably heard it from me before that the sort of thing I hate when people talk about is when they said that this sort of thing is easy. The people that make the worst sort of books or TV shows or comic books or films are the sort of people who make those sorts of things do it because they think it's easy to do. They think it's easy to write a film or to direct or to do art. Here's the thing, because I had an interesting revelation about this. It's only easy if you decide to make it easy. you could have a very but to do that you have to go right back to basics. And the problem is that Chris doesn't really seem to have time to do things that are just basic and elementary. Maybe Chris could have done with, I don't know, doing like a small story like for very young kids before this. Like just do something that, it just demonstrates what you're doing more than anything else. If you could accomplish something like that, then guess what? Everything else should, as you work your way up, you should become more experienced and more adept to what you're doing. And bear in mind, there was a time when I had to do this as well. But guess what? It's just you pick it up as you go. When I did a script at university, I started off with one draft. I then realized that there were too many plot holes with it, thinking, what's exactly stopping people talking to each other if it's just in a classroom? So the second draft was they moved it to a school hall and it was during an exam where it would be extremely problematic if people were talking while there was an exam going on. So that gets the head around the idea of why can't they just go up and talk to each other? And then you get into a third draft where you're wondering, well, even if somebody was trying to get somebody's attention, why was that person just ignoring them? Simple, have them sit further ahead or further behind so that they couldn't really see in their eye line about what was going on. And basically, it works. It works like that. And by the way, it's just, this is why you proofread this stuff. This is why you begin to question yourself. Well, hang on a second. Why don't they just get up and talk to each other? Or are they where are they physically in this hall if they're doing this exam? This is, and what I'm trying to get across, ladies and gentlemen, is that this is not really that hard. You just need to take some time and show some respect for what you do, and you can see for yourself exactly how this is all going to work. This is how you do it because it's worked for centuries, and it's hardly going to change anytime soon just because AI is on its way. Okay, let's get back. On a similar note, speech often includes hand-drawn emoticons. Even when not text warning, Chris's dialogue is highly unnatural. He appears to have no grasp of voice, with nearly all his characters using the same stilted tone, verbosity, and quickisms. This can easily be seen in earlier issues where the phrase boyfriend-free girl pops up from multiple characters. This may be a symptom of his lacking theory of mind. He believes that, since he talks in this fashion, so does everybody else. The heavy-handedness, stiltedness, and single-mindedness may be symptomatic of his autism. Plot and drama. Chris's confused understanding of reality and fantasy affects his ability to write captivating fiction. Because Chris considers his creations to be alive in some parallel universe, he finds that giving them artificially happy and uncomplicated lives is satisfying, and assumes that his true and loyal fanbase shares this interest. Chris seeks to avoid tension or suspense that would trouble his creations and his intended audience wherever possible. Thus, he is unwilling to depict his characters in peril that is convincing, and therefore real, and wants to pair them off early and dwell on their long, idyllic romances. Villains tend to put up laughably little challenge, and the protagonists usually win with a show of devastating and effortless force. Virtually every fight ends with the heroes winning almost immediately and with little difficulty. This is really bad in something like Solitude because it suggests the ideas that 1. The chaotic combo is so overpowered that the enemies are a joke, or that the enemies had absolutely no real clue about what they were doing, and so therefore, whenever they come back again, it makes the heroes look stupid because they celebrated far too early, they're rather just finishing off their enemies. It's called the disillusionment of tension, which is something that also happens very regularly in Power Rangers Super Mega Force. Yeah. Initially, villains are allowed to posture about a little before Solitude runs up to ruin their shit. But as the comic goes on and Chris comes into conflict with internet trolls, the battles become even shorter and less climactic for the sake of emphases. Likewise, any instances emotional drama between characters are resolved immediately. And again, wasted opportunity right here. What if Chris came in one day and said, if you two don't knock it off, I'll destroy both of you as you stand. That's a good way to show like Chris is deteriorating to the dark side. As though, no, anything that is going to inconvenience him now, even slightly, he is going to threaten acts of violence. An early exception to the above can be found in sub-episodes 7 and 8. In Solitude 4, in which Chris gets utterly curb-stomped by Baguette and the Jerkops under his administration. Even then, Chris's defeat only really happened because no one was there to save him, and was more or less made irrelevant with the arrival of Crystal. The only time where a problem was resolved without an artificially cherry resolution was in Solitude issue 11, wherein Sarah Rosechew fails to mend her relationship with Kevin the Jew. I'm not kidding, that might be another issue Chris has when it comes to writing, is that he knows nothing about how characters that shouldn't be where it begins and ends with Kevin. He needs to have a little bit more than just a name that could make people very uncomfortable to say out loud, especially if they're doing videos on YouTube. Though the character seems over it after crying a little about it. Similarly, previews and allusions to the future always emphasize victory over the forces of evil. A vision of the PVCC attacking Quickville ends rather conclusively with Chris saying, "Good, we've won." A terse preview for the following issue completely dismantles all the tension in the originally marginally dramatic plot arc. Next issue, I get out of the time void. His devotion to neutralizing tension is such that in Solitude 10, Magi-chan broke the fourth wall to permanently reveal that he would eventually fall in love with Sylvana, presumably so that readers would not have to worry about what would happen in them in the meantime. Even the worst writers would never use the words spoiler alert in one's own work, with experienced ones instead opting for foreshadowing. But Chris feels it necessary to spoil a yet-to-be-revealed plot point in the comic. And again, I could spend the rest of time talking about, like, the things I write and how I use, foreshadowing, or how I would use actual plot twists. Plot twists literally only ever work if they happen in such a way that they are logical to the story, but they completely take the audience off guard. Like, one example you could argue that this isn't the case is in the end of the first Saw film, where the guy where John Kramer is revealed he's just lying half dead in the bathroom, and then he gets up at the end, and it's him who's revealed who's the real mastermind behind all these games in the first place. And the only reason he stayed where he was to make sure the rules were enforced, because Zepp had no actual influence when he was watching the game unfold, monitors outside. So it all comes down to the idea that, well, it was the only way the rules could be enforced, but, well, how on earth did you even find the resource? And you don't even really need to watch like the rest of the series for this to be enjoyable. You just need to see it as though it was the one thing you weren't expecting. You weren't expecting the guy to get up. More to the point, to have an active role in this story. Beyond corpse that lies on the ground with a gun in his hands. As you might guess, on top of everything else, this makes the storyline for Solitude unendurably boring. Ironically, the sole exception to this rule is Chris himself, but even this treatment is baffling. As the activities of Comic Chris are based on his creator, he is unable to simply resolve Chris's love quest quickly and easily, but it doesn't stop him from trying. Thus, even while his doppelganger accumulates more and more superpowers and allies, he is still shown being curiously ineffectual, unable to handle most threats without help, and before long his insipid romantic efforts have become the sole outstanding arc. However, this is less the result of Chris's skill at dramatic writing and more his lack of skill with love and life. That Comic Chris fails even with every card stacked in his favour only reflects that the real one does too. And whenever Chris thinks his love quest might be over in real life, he attempts to give it the typical easy resolution in the comics as well. The actual plotting for Sonichu is problematic as well. Chris interjects new ideas very abruptly, and often with no real logic or progression, just because they caught his fancy. For instance, there's absolutely no reason Chris to suddenly be using Yu-Gi-Oh cards and terms in Sonichu issue 5. He was just interested in them at the time, and he was writing it. There's no scene where Chris gets a magic deck of trading cards or anything to explain why he can suddenly cast spells. The same goes for Darkbind Sonichu. Chris was simply interested in The Legend of Zelda and Darkwing Duck at the same time, and wanted to put the two franchises in his comic. And after publishing Sonichu issue 0, Chris lost interest in the story and abandoned the story until Sonichu issue 10, when Chris loses interest in an idea he presents in his comic. He will resolve it in a quick and often unsatisfying manner. Characters once meant to enter the main cast, such as Ivy, will then be killed off, panel no less, so that Chris can proceed to his next plotline of interest. Other dropped narrative threads, such as Meg-chan or Blanca, might only get a sentence or two tying up the loose ends, and some, for example Jigglyarmy, are simply never referred to again. The comic's narrative is yet further clouded by the unsteady rate at which Chris updates, along with his habit of occasionally working out of order. For example, Chris ends this last story in Sonichu issue 9 with announcing that God Jesus had guided him to love with Panda Halo, only for God to have God and Jesus suddenly introduce him to Ivy in the very next issue, with no explanation for why the Lord of Lords is backtracking on his dating advice to his favourite son. When Chris adds something to a Sonichu comic due to the presence of another party, he is known to make these additions unsatisfying on purpose for the parties requesting them. The most stupefying example may be the Time Void subplot, written in after criticism that his alter ego took up too much of the comic's time. Chris almost removes himself from the action for almost 2 issues, and when it unceremoniously ends, it just so happens to leave him ready to indulge in the most self-servicing revenge fantasy yet. World building. Again, as a writer myself, world building is one of the most satisfying and fun things you can do as a writer, because it is your world. It is coming from your fingers, your pen, your typed words. You can do just about whatever you like with it, as long as it's coherent, it has cohesion, it makes sense within the laws of the world you create, and you don't just pull random things out of your ass like Chris using Magic Cylinder for no real reason. I mean, if we are to believe the idea that this is all like meant to be an amalgamation of pop culture references and things Chris just rips off, well, you would have thought it would have sounded more interesting, but it isn't. In a literal fantasy world, it is common to establish interesting details, backgrounds, and laws around the impossible things that happen inside it. This not only appeals to your average fantasy nerds, autistic inclining to hoard information, but it gives intrigue and context to the story and the plight of the characters. As for Chris's laws, would only limit the spam of his power trips. One need only look at his visual backgrounds to gauge his interest in implementing thematic ones, and details hold as much meaning as his passing internet in them, i.e. Yu-Gi-Oh! Battles abruptly showing up and fading out just as quickly. Visual clarity. Frig me. Like many children, Chris is unconcerned with making his work clear and easily read. Chris does not plan page layouts in advance and instead draws panels one at a time, cramming however many he can onto the page and further harming his comic's visual clarity. Like I said, this is why you bother doing, storyboards in the first place. This is why you prepare for these sorts of things. You don't just do it in one go and say, good job, print. He does not understand or perhaps care that word balloons and text boxes must be arranged left to right and top to bottom, in the intended order to each panel, and that the panel's art must be set to accommodate that order. The dialogue flow in panels with multiple word balloons in Sonichu regularly must be pieced together from context clues by the reader. The worst example of this is seen below. Chris establishing a reading order by numbering lines of dialogue. That's the kind of bullshit you wouldn't even see in something like oh wait, hang on, no, this did happen in Marvel number 3. By the way, if you've never read Marvel before, ladies and gentlemen, I'll save you the trouble. Don't do it. And bear in mind, you want to talk about nonsensical stories. Marvel started off as a parody of Smallville, and then it devolves into a very, very preachy environmentalist message that also became a very, very preachy writer's descent into madness about how his comic book wasn't published because people didn't care about what he had to say. Possibly even more self-centered than Chris. Chris as a poet and lyricist. I'd lay her down, caress her gently, tickle her fancy, have her tickle my fancy, and give it to her with the learned, lonely experience I've endured. Chris expertly stirring feelings of both mild disgust and confusion. In poem and lyric, Chris has a poor understanding of the anatomy of an appealing composition. He mistakes exceedingly saccharine language for the romantic. He also pads out gaps with random access humour and curiously dated language. He has total disregard for proper meter and rhymes are forced with bizarre neologisms. Rosy as often as birds tweet, will you be my lovely heart sweet? Sometimes he can't even manage to make it rhyme. Heartbroken, sad, and very lonely, I may never remove my virginity. The result is poetry that occupies the uncanny valley between metric and free verse form. Not even the Bard of Avon is safe from Chris. In sub-episode 3, a famous line from Macbeth has a stupid couplet of Chris making tacked on at the very end. I shatter hearts as I please. I hurt them hard with the greatest of ease. While Bubbles mutilates a line from The Tempest in Solitude issue 8. Needless to say, the contrast is not that hard to see. Chris as a journalist. Nintendo Power Magazine was a publication released by Nintendo about Nintendo products. It sought to inform video game enthusiasts anything they may want to know about Nintendo products, and how they should feel about them. It is easily Chris's single greatest journalistic influence. To this day, he seeks to plainly tell the masses what the truth is and how we should feel about it. Like most journalists, ironically. Chris's first notable work of journalism is his final project in high school, A Week with Christian Chandler. It is a prime example of Chris's understanding of honesty. With any luck. The only thing that could reflect poorly on him in his mind was the omission of any fact whatsoever. Pretty bad from journalism, I'd say. Chris saw fit to document anything and everything that happened, including sleeping through class. At this early stage, it seems that Chris was unwilling to massage the truth because he had yet to experience the disapproval of peers that concerned him, as the reactions of internet trolls would later. Chris's next journalistic effort came in college with Solitude News Dash, which operated under the characteristic presumption that the details of his daily life were of inherent reader interest. Funnily enough, his style of reminiscent of yellow journalism being categorized by little regard for conventional journalistic ethics or consistency, scare headlines in huge print, often of minor news, lavish use of pictures or imaginary drawings, use of faked interviews, misleading headlines, pseudoscience, and a parade of false learning from so-called experts. Emphasis on full-colour Sunday supplements, usually with comic strips, conflicts of interest, topics that affect the author directly, a big no-no in journalism, except in opinion pieces. Dramatic sympathy with the underdog against the system. Chris being Chris also incorporates elements from tabloid journalism such as sensational crime stories, gossip columnists about celebrities and sports stars, and junk food news. Basically, the entirety of the Daily Star for that matter. After watching a Tsuchumo's documentary about him, Chris gave his own ideas about the production of a similar piece. To the surprise of no one, he wanted to focus more on the positives, like the people whose lives had made better by interacting with him. I don't know where they are, but there we are. Chris as a blogger. Okay, so it looks like Instagram has a character limit per post. I can work with that. Chris in the middle of writing a wall of text. Chris's blogging is a continuation of the News Dash, mentioned above. In a way, Chris's first and most frequently updated blog was his web page, in which he posted updates about his goings-on, such as they were. Most updates were simply denouncements of a certain dean. This site, however, was not in what most people would consider a blog format. Instead of archiving and replacing old content with newer material, Chris simply stuck new updates wherever he could find new space that day, resulting in an erratic and bizarre page layout. He also experimented with conventional blog formats, and the results were only marginally easier to read. To this date, Chris has had several actual blogs. PSN blogs, the official Solitaire and RoseTube blog, a small MySpace blog, the Quick blog, and Twitter. The location may change, but the style is consistent and unmistakable. This may be linked to Chris not knowing exactly the purpose of a blog. Ideally, on a blog, one publishes one's opinions and experiences in a group setting, allowing constant, meaningful communication. While Chris has no problems sharing intimate details about his life, he doesn't seem to get the communicative part down. Blogs are just another place for him to spew truth and honesty, as well as to try to incite action against his detractors. Another arguably more important fault with Chris's blogging is that Chris's blogs are fucking boring. Successful bloggers post about their life in much the same way as anybody else would, but they know that they need to keep it entertaining to read. While Chris did unintentionally cause the occasional laugh, most entries are outright annoying. Arguably, the most notable blog Chris ever made was the infamous Adam Stackhouse blog. Seething with anger, Chris showed that, just like with Wikipedia, he doesn't want to contribute but enforce his beliefs on anyone who will listen. In any case, I loathe Adam and his sister for stealing my one and only chance at taking my sweet girlfriend to Seattle. It would have been terrific. I might have been able to change her outlook on not planning on having children. She and I are both virgins, although I am a frustrated, highly functioning autistic 25-year-old virgin, and I loathe Sabushwald and Applescree as well, because their music probably landed those jerks in second and third place. Chris as an essayist. While in high school, Chris was persuaded to stop napping long enough to write several graded essays. Oh god, not again. Not these again. The lessons he failed to learn from these experiences continue to influence his prose style. Chris's education in essay writing seems to be being limited to the basic 5-paragraph essay. Chris was trained to think of the intro paragraph as the appetizer, the body paragraphs respectively as veggie, potatoes, rice, pasta, and meat, and the conclusion as dessert. Anything related to food seems to reach Chris. It's not even that really hard to get down anyway, so it's probably for the best. Despite having such a sophisticated structural apparatus at his disposal, Chris's essays were shallow and incoherent. In part, this was a product of the assignment restrictions. His essay, Work versus Student Life, for example, was only 100 words long, which, even for a competent writer, is unusually strict. His history essay, Japan 1912 to 1949, which appears to be his first foray into the genre, lacks a clear thesis sentence. Well-organized body paragraphs, or a meaningful conclusion. Not to mention using World War I sources in points about World War II. You are not hearing that wrong, by the way. His teacher understandably deemed it very confusing and unclear. Another history essay, Who Was Our Best President?, does a better job of segregating many ideas within the 3 body paragraphs, but remains extremely rigid and rote. His Canterbury Tales essay has no real structure at all, and simply retells one of Chaucer's morality tales in a rambling narrative. For this assignment, he received only 2 out of 10 points for clarity of expression. These limitations and oversights have carried over into what non-fiction writing Chris has done as an adult. Nearly all of his non-fiction prose has been autobiographical, and what fiction he writes generally involves suspiciously familiar material. The only real exception has been Chris Chan's heroic dream for our community now and in the future. His clarion call for dating education when he submitted to a contest in 2009. Here, there is nothing to suggest that Chris has ever learned even the basics of essay writing. With its buried thesis, its unsupported paragraphs, its idiosyncratic capitalization, and a fucking frowny face. Chris's essays are about his favourite subject, himself. Similarly, show little regard for writing standards. Story of My Current Days has a thesis of sorts, but the body is simply a clumsily structured retelling of events which Chris expects the reader to glean meaning from without any assistance from him. His much expanded Wikipedia profile has a self-serving thesis and is helpfully carved into subheadings, but remains fluid and disjointed. The several essays he wrote for the Wikipedia share the same first draft problems of sentence-long paragraphs and an unappealing potpourri of boldface, italics, and capitalization. And, well, we can certainly put a very big full stop on Chris and his writing. So, ladies and gentlemen, what exactly have we learned today? Well, that Chris's writing standards are worse than his artwork. I would say they're almost even worse in some way, because there are quite a number of other moving parts when it comes to writing. Only some more moving parts, but I think it's almost the same sort of idea. And the fact that even when I come to think about it, if I had like a very real stab at actually trying to write, or at least just do the writing for a comic or for an actual book, I would probably stand maybe in somewhat better stead due to just understanding and actually being more interested to know more about how I can improve my work compared to what Chris does. Let me know, by the way, if you want me to actually try and like do like an entire writing stream on a different channel. That might be of some interest, perhaps. So, with all that being said and done, I hope all of you guys have enjoyed Chris and writing, and we are almost coming to the end of these now, and I genuinely cannot believe it. So, I hope you guys have enjoyed it, and I cannot wait to see all of you guys again in the next video. Take care, and bye-bye for now.